Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts find their way up to the heart of God this morning. Amen. Church, I have a confession to make. When I was 8 or 9 years old, my mother and I went to a CVS around Easter time, and there was a big display of Easter candy, baskets and bunnies. You can imagine it. And I very, very humbly asked my mother for just one little chocolate egg, but she said no. And I very humbly asked again, and she said no. And then I started to get pretty mad. I was so mad that I decided I was going to do something bad to get back at her. So as we approached the checkout line, I pocketed that little egg and decided that I was going to have that egg one way or another. And oh boy, when I tell you, as we left that store, I had adrenaline coursing through my body. I was totally getting away with it. And then I started to feel kind of scared. What if I did get away with it? What if I had to keep the secret that I was a thief? Would that make me a bad kid? I could only stand it for about 15 minutes before I shamefully pulled the piece of candy out of my pocket in the car to show my mother. And she was mad, but gracious. She took us right back to CVS, and we found a clerk, and I apologized, and I returned the candy, and that was it. My wrong had been made right, and I was forgiven in the eyes of our local CVS, and more importantly, the eyes of my mother. And thus ended my brief but glorious life of crime. Our text today is about Zacchaeus the tax collector. And from Sarah's story, you can probably imagine already that being a tax collector was not the best career choice for someone who wanted to be loved by his community. But before Zacchaeus was a tax collector, he probably was a beloved member of the community of Jericho. You see, when Rome entered a city, they looked for people who were deeply entrenched in their communities to take this job because they wanted someone who would know how much tax to charge all of their neighbors. So people didn't just hate tax collectors because they were coming around like Tony Soprano saying, "Where's my money?" They hated tax collectors because they were feeling a deep betrayal. The people of Jericho had probably watched Zacchaeus grow up, had probably changed his diaper, but he had chosen to align himself with the occupying army. And we don't know why. We don't know much about Zacchaeus. Maybe he thought that being a tax collector was his best bet at making a living. Maybe he had gotten in a fight with an elder and decided that he was going to do something bad to get back at them. But we don't know for sure. I imagine that Zacchaeus was racked with guilt, that this whole tax collector thing had gotten out of hand. I imagine Zacchaeus was desperate to be reconciled with his friends and his family and his neighbors. But how could he even start to repair those relationships? Sometimes when we've done something bad, we start to think that that is all we know how to do. Has anyone else ever felt that? Yes. Robin has, so have I. Zacchaeus' situation seems hopeless. but Jesus is on his way. Do you all know that Massachusetts was in a drought this summer and last summer? The change in weather patterns is just one of those reminders that we are in a period of global climate collapse caused by human activity. It's certainly enough to make anyone feel hopeless. Humanity has taken advantage of our earth, our home. We've betrayed our community of creation. We've extracted, we've polluted, we've been wasteful, we've been greedy. We've done so much wrong in the world that sometimes it feels like that's all we know how to do. And if you think about it, our society is structured to make us forget the value of water in a drought. We take long showers, we don't pay close attention to water restrictions, we use fertilizers and pesticides on our lawns that run into our reservoirs and our aquifers. We allow companies to buy lakes and rivers so that they can bottle that water in plastic and sell it back to us, and then the majority of those bottles end up floating in the ocean. And this carelessness that we are all guilty of, myself included, ripples out to all of creation. Because water is life, and when we stop paying attention to water, we stop paying attention to life. It ripples out to the thousands of species of insects, fish, birds, and all creatures, big and small, who are crying out for help in this age of mass extinction that we find ourselves in today. It ripples through communities of color, our indigenous neighbors, and our trans children, who are crying out for help in this age of state-sanctioned violence that we find ourselves in today. In the 80s and again in the early 2000s, the United Church of Christ, which is a denomination that this church is affiliated with, commissioned a study on toxic waste in America, and each time the study found that more than any other factor, even controlling for income and education, the number one determinant of if you are going to live next to a toxic waste dump is the color of your skin. And we know this isn't right. None of us think this is good. But most of us can't even begin to imagine a better way. In 2004, in response to a truly reprehensible lack of clean water on Indigenous reserves in the US and Canada, 2 Anishinaabe grandmothers started the Mother Earth Water Walkers to remind us of what we've forgotten, that water is sacred. This group of Indigenous activists walk around the Great Lakes that their people have called home for thousands of years. In total, since 2004, they have walked more than 10,000 miles. I hope they were wearing their Fitbits. The Anishinaabe, like so many other Indigenous nations, recognize that water is not just a resource to be used up, but is a sacred being. They teach us that water is a relative, a member of our community. Christian activist Ched Meyer proposes that Christians need to reorient themselves to be watershed disciples. Now, for those of you who don't know, a watershed is an area of land, including all of its inhabitants, where all the water flows into the same source. Meyer suggests that if you want to save the world, you need to start with your watershed, your community. And at First Church, we know that water is sacred. Just a few weeks ago for Homecoming Sunday, we all brought waters from our sacred places and we mingled them together. And over the course of the year, we used those waters to baptize our babies and mark their new life in the church. Water already holds a special place in our community. And it's through water that we are all related. If you think about it, our bodies are 70% water. And if you drink sterling tap water, you're about 70% water from the Wekapiki aquifer that the town draws from. And the person next to you is also made up of that same water. Water weaves us together like this. Water is the matriarch that hosts holidays and organizes reunions and brings over a lasagna when you're sick and calls you up to let you know all the goings on in the family. And right now, the water is calling us to let us know that our family needs help. But family's complicated. Navigating those relationships is so hard. And Zacchaeus knew that. That's why when Jesus shows up in Jericho, Zacchaeus needs to hear him speak. He runs ahead of the crowd and climbs a sycamore tree to see over the masses. Maybe he felt safer in that sycamore tree than down below with all of the people who had every reason to hate him. And Jesus spots him in the tree. Zacchaeus, he calls out, "Get out of that tree, I'm coming over for dinner tonight." And the crowd is like, what the heck? This guy? This guy is a sinner. You're going to his house? Really? But Jesus wasn't just inviting himself over to Zacchaeus' house. He was inviting himself into Zacchaeus' heart. And Zacchaeus sees the opportunity for redemption, and he takes it. "Look, Lord," Zacchaeus says, "here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." He makes reparations, not metaphorically, but materially. He tries to fix what he's done wrong. And what he's doing in Jericho is an example of restorative justice. And while my mom wouldn't have called it this at the time, what we practiced in that CVS was also restorative justice. Restorative justice seeks to right the wrong that has been done by repairing what has been broken and restoring the community that's been harmed. My mother didn't ground me or yell at me. Once we had fixed what I had done wrong, she looked at me and said, "Katy, you were so scared. It was so bad. It couldn't be fixed. But we fixed it. Let's go home." You can tell this woman knew Jesus, right? I have to say it because she's right there. Zacchaeus' betrayal was a little bit deeper than a 25-cent Easter egg. He knew that he needed to prove that he was really changing. He doesn't just pay back what he's taken, but pays back 4 times the amount of the harm done. What would it look like if our society committed to paying back 4 times the harm that we've done to our community of creation? It's hard to imagine, but we don't have to imagine that hard because we have an example of what it would look like right here in our very own watershed. Does anybody know what watershed Sterling is a part of? If you know it, shout it out.
You said it, but I don't remember the word.
Nashua River Watershed. The Nashua River Watershed, that's our community. Now, in 1966, the Nashua River was declared septic. Nothing could survive in the river except for sludge worms. There was no oxygen in the water. At the time, there were no laws against dumping toxic waste into rivers. Can you imagine that? That's disgusting. The story goes that the river would run a different color each day based on what the factories were producing that morning. People thought that the Nashua River was a lost cause. But a local woman, Marion Stoddard, didn't think it was a lost cause. She formed a committee to clean up the Nashua River. And although their work was very long and very slow and took many, many years, the Nashua River Cleanup Committee put enormous pressure on the state to start cleaning up watershed treatment facilities and to start outlawing the dumping of toxic waste into rivers as it should be. Once the work got going and people saw that they were really making a difference, everyone wanted to join the committee. A president of one of the paper factories that had just a few years ago been dumping toxic waste into the river joined the committee and said, "I don't want to wear the black hat anymore. I want to be one of the good guys." This is one of the most beautiful things about human beings, I think. We want so badly to be good. Once we believe that restoration is possible, we chase it down. Marion Stoddard says that at the time she formed this committee, she was looking for the largest challenge she thought she could complete in her lifetime. And she made a lifetime commitment to restore the river. It's an impulse that goes against our culture of busyness and burnout that leaves us hopeless and depleted. It's been 60 years since the committee was formed, but now more than half of the river's banks are permanently protected. That's over 200 miles of the watershed. And the river and its surrounding greenways host fish, birds, tadpoles, dragonflies, and countless other creatures. This is an example of what restorative climate justice could look like. Marion Stoddard stood over the poisoned Nashua River, a river of death, and said, "One day, these waters will run clear." And Zacchaeus looked over a crowd of people who despised him, and he thought, "One day, these people will be my family again." You stand on holy ground in the Nashua River watershed. And I'm telling you now that one day this watershed will be a haven for people displaced by climate change. One day our community of creation will be healed, will be made whole, and we will protect our land. We will protect our waters from pollution and greed and waste, and we will pay back 4 times the amount of harm we've done. Jewish scholar Rabbi Tarfon says, "You are not required to finish the work, yet neither are you permitted to desist from it." There will not be a quick and dirty solution to the climate crisis. The work of restoration, the work of salvation is not easy. But Jesus reminds us that it is always possible.